Before we proceed, there was a request to share certain experiences from my last trip, and in particular, the experience with the UN Summit, United Nations Summit on Climate Change. This is a program that I have been participating in for some years with a group based in New York that brings together practitioners, deep practitioners from various traditions, religious, spiritual, from all over the world, and to organize gatherings, some exchanges, some dialogue, not so much about the religion or its practices or beliefs, but their spiritual experience, and create a deeper connect between them. At various occasions, what was described as a Sufi yogi dialogue, Sufis from Pakistan, from Afghanistan, and a few other places, and people from the yogic tradition within and around India. Similarly, they had Buddhist and Yogi summit and various combinations of this kind in different places. But one of the focal points for these kinds of meetings has been the UN Climate Summit, where there is an effort also to bring, with a small group of such leaders, younger activists in the area where this meeting is taking place. And we had last year, for example, it was in Morocco. So many young activists from Africa and regions around had been brought together. Earlier, we had, not with the UN summit, but a similarly themed gathering with young leaders from the Americas, South America, Central America, and North America, meeting in Costa Rica. And of course, the year before, there was a similar meeting during the UN Climate Summit in Paris. Going back 5 or 6 years that I have been seeing these meetings. And each time it has been different with the groups that we have met. This time it was being in Germany, although officially the host country was Fiji. Since Fiji did not have the facilities, it was finally hosted in Germany. And we had a gathering of people mostly from Europe, young people, activists in their own space. And the people coming as, let's say, mentors from these different spiritual and religious traditions were trying to bring in the aspect of the deeper causes of the current crisis in the not only climate but overall ecology and human existence from the deeper traditions and their knowledge to try to mend with what these younger people were doing, In most cases, the younger people were selected to be people who had already some alignment with this, some alignment with these ideas. And one of the objectives has been during these meetings to actually go into the space in the UN summit region where there are two halves, the government half and then there is the NGO half. And we have a program in the NGO half themed along these lines with these people praying together, invoking some higher presence and influence and sharing these ideas so that we may create a field that will impact those who are taking decisions in the political space. Some of our delegates are also permitted to go to the political space and as observers and be present there. Some of them meditate, pray, or do whatever it is that they find will help to influence or bring a higher spiritual influence into that space. While we were in Bonn this time, we had a few meetings first outside before we went to the UN space. And in these meetings, we had discussions amongst ourselves with the young people. And something unusual came up in some of these, which I thought interesting as a perspective. I noted that many of these young leaders had no idea what was really happening in the rest of the world. They lived at a level of comfort which gave them no sense that perhaps 80% of humanity is in a very different condition. Some of them, even in their presentations, had a certain quality of, well, I will say from ignorance, but an elitism coming from that ignorance. In one of the presentations, for example, it was a group from Switzerland. They were showing pictures of how the glaciers are melting, how the environment is changing. And then somebody said in that, so all the glaciers, the waters are accumulating in place, and there are lakes forming in places where they should not be because people are living there. And so afterwards, I made this observation that there is a peculiar approach where we are seeing things from the human perspective only. The lake should not be there because human beings are living there. But I said, first, human beings have disturbed Earth's balance. When Earth is compensating for the balance by accumulating water in the shallow spaces where she cannot do otherwise, then we then try to block her water, try to divert the water, and further damage her corrective processes. And it didn't strike them. It had never struck them to think like that. So I thought it interesting to see the very people working as activists or trying to solve the problems do not see things more deeply. Somebody else was giving a presentation of how after a certain hurricane in the US, so many $1 billion worth of damage, they said it will take 1 year to rebuild that whole space where the water had come. And I was sitting next to a Native American leader, and he resonated with my statement. He said, don't you realize that Earth is compensating? Sea levels rise or whatever happens, Earth is compensating. Why rebuild in the same space? We should move on. We should find a different space. But somehow in the human thinking, we tend to be so human-centric that we do not even recognize the complexity of what is really happening. So this was one observation. On the last day, I'm skipping the sequence, but on the last day, I felt I needed to say something about this. A group of young people were dissatisfied with the discussions happening, and they wanted to do their own thing. So we said, okay, go ahead. And they did a kind of something which is very common in the new age. They asked people to stand in two circles. The inner circle is now the old earth, the outer circle is the new earth, and old earth or present earth, and the present earth speaks to the old earth, and then the old earth becomes new earth. They speak to each other. They feel tearful. They feel guilty. They feel emotionally overwhelmed. They hug each other, and something which I personally did not align with, and there were a few people with me also coming from. One of them was somebody from a Sufi tradition. She could not stand it because the whole thing got so emotional and as if the whole consciousness was pulled down, not lifted up. And so I had the last say after that session, and I had to carefully shift things back without entering into conflict by pointing out that, and of course this idea that bless the earth and save the earth and we will correct things. Oh, one of the groups even made the statement, we had a long discussion about what we need to do and we came to the conclusion that we are already doing everything that we need to. So it was very self-satisfied. And so I had to say, look, we need to review our perspective. This idea that the earth is so fragile that we can destroy her and we need to save her is a little immature. If Mother Earth shakes her body just a little bit, it's enough to wipe out humanity. If she does not, it's because she is patient and she's waiting for us to wake up. And just the physical size and scope of Earth's movements, one hurricane is enough to wipe out an entire city. That should tell you that she is not so fragile. Yes, we are poisoning her and destroying her, but we need to change our alignment, rather listen to what she feels, she advises or guides us to in setting right our ways. Rather, we should learn from her. And so there is the physical earth, and then there is the emotional earth, and then there is the mind and awareness of the earth. And all these exercises are good to relate to her on those levels. But there's also spiritual earth. And she is a divine being, a goddess. And with an extraordinary power and a presence, and we need to relate to her on that level. It is from there that the transforming power will come, which will not only help to reset this mess, but also help us to awaken to our own higher potential. So it was something along these lines I tried to shift the focus. And then I took to a more distinctive focus because I felt this was going off track and they had not really got into anything real deep. So I said, you need to recognize where all this comes from. What is the mindset which is causing this problem? And so I began to go to its roots. I said, we praise so many indigenous peoples. We had people from the Amazons, from the Native American, from the African spaces, various others. And I said, we praise them for what? Is it because you feel guilty? You put them up, you photograph them with their headdress, you feel guilty because you have destroyed their cultures. Or is there something that they have which you have lost that you need to regain? What is it that is bothering you? And what is it that has gone wrong? So I started going deeper into it. I said, everywhere, including in Europe, people lived in harmony with nature until about 300 years ago. Around the time when there was, in Europe, referred to as the Age of Enlightenment, an activation of the rational mind in a strong way, certain values, progressively, Europe began to go out of sync with nature. And with it began also a wide-ranging colonial phase in which these very values were spread all over the world. And what are the core elements of these values? Because you see, wherever the colonization has gone, nature was destroyed. And the natural balance between man and nature was ruined. So even Europe had it and Europe lost it from this point on. So I pointed to a few of these key shifts. I said, first was the shift which came with science declaring that all nature and we ourselves are a product of a competitive, destructive competition which is the driver of evolution. The idea that evolution is driven by survival of the fittest. That this survival implies a competition, aggressive and destructive, where all those who are not fit enough are destroyed so that the fit will survive. This idea has become the key meme. It not only defined the values in Europe of the last few hundred years, it spread all over the world with science. And we've been taught that all growth takes place in a destructive competition. So you see, our educational system is based on that. Our economic system, political system, all hierarchically organized systems are based on this idea. So from childhood, you are competing with each other. One person gets the award and 99% are not getting the award. So that one person can win, 99 have to lose. But if you observe nature, in nature you do not see destructive competition. If at all you see competition, it is collaborative. It's not even competition in that sense. It's as if everything is helping everything else. Everything is nourishing everything else while being nourished by everything else. And the whole seems to grow. And so this idea of a destructive survival of the fittest competition is at the root of this whole problem. And today this idea is so deeply rooted, our economic system is also built this way. It is the basis for what has later become the racism, colonization, as well as the destruction, because only that which is strong enough to destroy others is worthy of survival. Now, I was getting into this. Some people got very agitated. And I don't know what it was, but then they started telling me, you wind up, you should stop. There was still enough time. So I turned to the group and I said, is this important for you? And somebody from within Europe said, are you teaching creationism? Creationism. Creationism, that is what is believed by some biblical followers, that the whole world was created. Creationism. Creationism. That the whole world was created in one go. And I said, where does this come from? I'm speaking of something totally different. And I realized that his problem was this concept of destructive competition is so identified with evolution that when you question destructive competition, to them it sounds like I'm questioning evolution. And so we had a bit of a discussion. I said, I didn't even mention that. I'm only speaking of this meme. And he said, yeah, but you are sounding like one of those people who believes that there is no evolution. I said, but I'm just speaking of an evolution which is collaborative and not competitive. And so it was going off track. And in case I found a few people uncomfortable, so I wound up. I said, look, the problem continues because of these memes. The second meme is also that you are being taught that this life is by chance, that molecules fell in place to form your body by chance, and you have a single life which ends. So what's the right thing to do? Well, the moment's pleasure is all that remains. And since everything happened by chance, you could just as well finish by chance, meanwhile quickly finish all your satisfaction of desire. That's the mindset. Whereas earlier, all the values had a sense of purpose, a sense of direction. And you were taught to think in terms of generations. As children, you were taught that you are the product of many generations of effort. And every action you take, you should see its implications down 7 generations. And so we were taught to think in terms of larger expanse of time and space and community. And suddenly we have been narrowed down into this individuality which is there accidentally in a blip of a moment. And so it does not matter if you destroy things, because it doesn't matter really. And so this is one of the other memes which I pointed to. And one more important comment which had come from that group. A group of young people in some discussion had commented somebody who was working with young people had shared with us that often the young people, they say, why is it that we have to inherit this mess of the environment? We have done nothing to deserve this. You people, that is the older people, are to blame. We have done nothing to deserve this. And I said, this mindset needs to be challenged because it's not true. The fact is they are as responsible, including these children who are activists today. They are as responsible as their parents and grandparents in the mess because, first I said, they are doing exactly the same thing their parents and grandparents did. If you do not change your mindset and your actions now, and you continue to perpetuate the same values, well, it will be far worse down the line. But you're only part of the problem. Second, I said, you do not realize, because you're thinking of yourself only in this moment, that you had created this problem in your previous incarnation, whose consequences you are facing today in this incarnation. And of course, for those who are not into that kind of thought, it was a bit new, but those with the Buddhist background, they went, oh yes, oh yes. And I said the same thing you have to think of. When now you leave the world and you take incarnation again, what kind of a world will you come to and what are you doing for that? You have to start thinking long term. And third, I said, there is also the aspect of the reaction to your own actions. You initiate a process and there are consequences and chains which go on. Not only which chase you across lives, but which remain in the environment, which come back to you in your own return. So these are perspectives which needed to be brought out. I could not go deeper into what I wanted to say about these values and memes which are causing this problem versus what are the original, I will use the word indigenous to all the world, including in Europe, values which need to be brought forward. And we didn't have enough time to have that kind of a detailed discussion, but it goes in the direction of Sri Aurobindo's statement, which is very clearly placed almost 100 years ago now. The future of the world, I'm paraphrasing, the future of the world depends on whether it chooses to follow the values of modern Europe or the values of the East. And it is that choice made by humanity which will determine what happens. And so this was one of the issues which came up and caused a bit of a ruffle. And I found this kind of self-satisfaction among the activists was not present in our meeting in Africa or in the meeting in the Costa Rica with the Americans. All of them were people who were suffering the impact of these things directly. They were not living forward, they were hitting at the grassroots the most extreme difficulties caused by the poisoning of the environment, the unbalanced economic development, the ecological destruction, and so on. We heard some pretty scary stories from people in Africa of how bad it has become and the extent to which these things have gone. And of late, there is the huge entry of China with the full power of the state entering into Africa, buying up gigantic areas of land, be taken home, setting up their own military to protect their investment, and so on. It is quite scary when you think about it, and one is reminded of Mother's warning and of precisely such a possibility of China overrunning the world and reducing it to a barren landscape. So this was one of the more complex interactions. But we had occasion to go on the river Rhone. Huh? Rhine? Okay, Rhine. I'm confused. We went on the river Rhine in a boat as a group, and as we were going down, three of us spoke from our different traditions. First, we had somebody from the Native American tradition, a leader who spoke of what waters mean and what the rivers are, almost like the veins of the earth, like the blood streams in our body. The rivers are such, and how the water relates to the human body, human life, and so on. We had somebody from the Sufi tradition who spoke about the deeper, subtle worlds and their relation with the water. And I spoke briefly about the Vedic perspective of the water, the symbolism of the rivers and what they mean. And to see the river not only as a physical stream of liquid, but also as a flow of energy and as a conscious energy, and even as in its origin a divine energy streaming. And you can relate on all these levels separately. But what is important is it is an energy which is what expresses itself in the water flow. If for some reason you block the water flow, you block the energy also. You will see in a flowing river, the water regenerates and cleans itself. You can put any amount of poison in it, somehow as you go down a few kilometers, you find the water is once again clearer. It somehow purifies itself in that churning process. The poisons are accumulated, gathered, either put into the ground or pushed aside, or even somehow transmuted. And this is there in all active rivers. But where you put a dam, this does not happen. The water is flowing at the end of some kilometers, but it does not have this vitality. And very quickly we find the water subsides and the river itself dies out. And it is possible for us to enter in relation with the consciousness of the river and even call it back, or ask her to intensify and revivify the waters. And so I suggested that while we are on the boat now, we can turn to the river and consciously relate to her as a being. I said, she is conscious of you even if you are not conscious of her. But when you become conscious of her, then she enjoys it and she responds. And we did that, and it was interesting. You could feel immediately, within seconds, the whole mood change and the river appeared different. It was so concrete. Meanwhile, it had been raining, and we were supposed to stop on the river bank and do a water ceremony. And this was to be done by a group from the Amazon. There were two Amazon leaders from their tradition who were to do some ceremony. But it was raining, it was cold, and somebody suggested, well, why don't we pray for the rain to stop? And so some of us decided, okay, we will do that. We went out, we started the ceremony. By the time we finished the ceremony, it had been raining all day long. It was cloudy all day long, and it stopped. The rain stopped. Bright sun came out. And all the rest of our journey back on the boat, we had bright sunlight. After we landed, once again the skies covered up and it started raining again. So we... Yes. So these are some interesting experiences in passing. We then went to the UN NGO space. So we were there for a whole day, and we had a program there at the end of the day. Some young people, activists, had organized a demonstration against the American government's policy, because I think it was the only government which came to the climate summit proposing clean coal and clean fossil fuels as a solution for the problem. Clean coal and fossil fuels. So some young people said this is not acceptable. They were Americans. They said we are going to do some activism, and they decided to stand up in the middle of the program and sing and walk out and things like that. So we saw how they were organizing themselves. It was interesting to see the energy. I'm not too sure how useful it is. It created a drama. Momentarily the newspapers covered it, but that's about it. So this is something which one has to review. But well, they did that whole program. We had, meanwhile, at the end of it, our own session. 7 people representing different traditions. We spoke from the perspective of Mother Earth and the need for change of our relationship, both with nature and with Mother Earth. And I think it was a powerful sharing. I went to the Indian Pavilion. It's interesting to see the last 2 years, the Indian Pavilion has been completely different. And it has been the single most prominent pavilion in the whole UN summit. And they had all kinds of presentations and projects, programs, solutions which the government of India is implementing. I was quite surprised to know that more than 40% of all new energy technology in India in the last 1 year, more than 40% has been renewable solar and wind. That's a big step in a single year. And the last year also they had something quite remarkable. So I was standing there and I was feeling a little proud. And then this woman comes, clearly Americans, dressed to appear like some VIP. And she was looking at these things. And I said to her, where the USA has failed, India has taken the lead. Where the USA has failed, India has taken the lead. You know, the US is withdrawing from the Paris agreement while the Indian Prime Minister was saying, we will go beyond our commitment. So it's literally the reversal. No other country is promising to go beyond the commitment. Everybody is thinking only short-term convenience to move as slowly as possible because nobody wants to commit to real change. This was the only country which said we will go more than what we have promised. So anyway, and then it turned out this lady was the governor of Oregon in the US. So some of us who were, some of our people from the US, they had a photo opportunity and all that. But overall, we were very disappointed what was happening in the UN space. Nobody, no country, no session was going deep enough. Everybody, all the themes of the sessions were opportunities for climate change technologies. You mean, how much money can you make with technologies which relate to climate change or protection of the climate or renewable energy? It was all about making money, not looking at the core issues or solving the problems. And of course, within the government discussions also, there was nothing significant which emerged. So even our young activists, they came away badly disappointed. And the message to them was simply this: you cannot wait for the governments. You have to start with yourself, in your own lifestyle, and mostly in your way of thinking first. So this is broadly what happened in Germany. Sorry? She spoke about the details. She spoke about the subtle reality behind the appearances. And that was all. That's all I remember now. But the gathering of people was exceptional and has always been like that. Just as an example of what kind of ripple effects this can have, nearly 10 years ago, this group had organized a similar program in Africa. One of the women from Zimbabwe, she was at that time perhaps 18. She went back so inspired, she started in her own village an activist movement to empower women to grow their own organic foods in their own kitchen gardens. And then over time that grew, it became larger, it became self-sustaining economically, and then it kept growing. So this time she had come after nearly 10 years. She's now 28, mother of 3 children, and still running this project, now involving 2,000 women who have all become independent financially because of their produce and their activities, and all of them are in sustainable agriculture and sustainable development. So this is one example of course, it's a remarkable example. The way they do it, she aligned herself with a group from Japan. They believe that when you plant food or any plant, you do not need any pesticides or fertilizers. You can pray and invoke directly on the seed, on the soil, relate to the soil with love, and nurture the plants purely with love. And what you can do can be miraculous. So she aligned herself with that group. And all her project with all these 2,000 women is actually done like this. And it's remarkable that they're actually able to grow larger vegetables, more healthy foods, more nutritious with nothing, no pesticide or fertilizers. So this was one of the interesting experiences. In Costa Rica, similarly, it was with a young group. It was over 3 days. And so initially they take time to begin to view things differently. And on the third day, I had one session where I was moderating, but I had this leader from the Native American tradition, Theo Cassin. He's an extraordinary being. Hopefully he will be visiting Auroville in February. We'll see if that works out. He's an extraordinary person. So we were sitting there and I told him, you will speak last. And he was like a rock. And that morning actually I had got up and I said, I'm not happy with what's happening. If I go back with this, I will say I wasted my time. I have to make a breakthrough. And something came and I said, we just go through. So I started by speaking about what it means to be colonized. Because all of these people from the Americas were coming from spaces that have been colonized. And I said, what happens when you're colonized? The way you lose your land, you lose your language, you lose your identity. And what happens inside you and what do you need to undo so that you can come back into your own and be an equal? So I was taking up these points one by one. And one could feel there was this huge response building. And in between there were 3 other people who were supposed to share. And I said, you step in whenever you feel like. So they caught certain points. They spoke about their work, their struggles, their activities. All of them were activists in their own space. And finally I said, and now Theo Cassin, the Native American speaker. And he spoke. And when he ended, literally, the group burst into tears. It was so intense for them. And the result, of course, was that they began to review their own way of looking at things. Because unfortunately, what has happened is we have been brought up with certain ways of thinking, which have been so deeply steeped, we do not even realize that one can think differently. And one of the things which we have to go back to is the older way of thinking which we had, where we saw things in continuities, which is closer to the intuitive way of thinking. The rational mind coming into its own cuts up, narrows, fixes into separate pieces. And yes, it's useful as a passage in evolution to firm and to define certain parts of the most superficial operations of the mind. But after that, we have to go back to that seeing where everything is one continuum, in which we put these distinctions only for our convenience. Not only in space, not only in interrelations, but also across time. And this shift is not difficult, because somewhere within us, that thing is still there. Because it is the truth of our deeper experience of life. It is the truth behind the surface mind also in the inner layers of our mind. And so to bring it forward is not difficult. Once you become aware, this is what's happening. If you stay stuck with your training and say, this is all that you can do, you cannot change. But the moment someone points out, oh, notice this is what you're doing. And then notice this is what you want to do, this is what your deeper impulse and instinct is. Just that awareness is enough to kickstart a process. And the changes begin to happen. So the intention there in these interactions was somehow if we can bring that into the awareness. And I think it was worthwhile at the end of it. I had a lecture in France. This was with adults in French. many of them don't have a conscious spiritual life. And what I mean by conscious spiritual is that, especially in France, there is a very strong reaction against spirituality and great fear of cults. And this is cult, any belief system, any following, any sect. Sect. A very strong fear. And so you wonder, how does spirituality come back? Because there's this clear rejection. And then there's a problem of language. The word for spirit or spirituality is esprit, which actually means mind. So, in French, esprit. And so the problem is, even if you speak of spiritual, it is understood as mental. At best, a refined abstract mental thinking, and that's all. So how do you bring that back, isn't it? And yet, because spirituality is our essence, it creeps back in its own way. And one of the forms I was interested to see among many is through many of these new age kind of healing and psychological practices. Some of it creeps in through the framework of yoga, de-stressing, some form of meditation for de-stressing. So you keep out the religious relation, throw that out. You avoid sects. You do not use any terms which would bind you to any system. But these are the ways in which it starts happening. And so much of it is through, there's crystal therapy, there is sound therapy, there is music therapy. They're all therapies in some way to make you feel good, except the feel good eventually points to some spiritual awakening. That's from in some such very mixed, heavily mixed. The group that, the main public function that I had already heard me earlier in some context. So many of them came, and by word, almost 70 people. And we went for about 2.5 hours. And the theme I had set was the impact of our education on our life today. And I went into these key beams that education has brought us up with, and how that is affecting our thinking as adults, our perspective of the world, our perspective of ourselves. Effectively, it was as if to undo some of these distortions and lead us to that awareness of something deeper, the spiritual identity. But without using any vocabulary which could be directly associated with religions or associated with some sect and so on. And then finally, towards the end, I said, well, I've avoided using this word so far, and it is the word divine. And I said, simply because of the associations that are there with it. And then I explained what I mean by divine, and distinguishing it from the religious concepts of God which they have rejected, and how this is something quite different. And then to speak of the sense of fulfillment in life and the divine in life, what form it takes and so on. I had quite an exceptional response from the feedback we received later. In one of the examples I had given, I had spoken about how itself needs to be recast if these values are to be, if these distortions are to be removed from our modern life. And I had briefly mentioned the approach of education we have in the ashram school, just to show that it's also equally practical. I gave certain examples. Examples I had given was how a teacher, instead of scolding you and telling you what you should do, which only causes rebellion from children, the teacher asks, what do you feel? What do you really want? And it causes the introspection. So one of the points I had made there was, we are taught from childhood to turn outward. We're taught to not turn inward. We're taught to ignore what's happening within. So if a child is sitting quiet and in a daydream, the parents will say, why are you wasting your time? Go and do something. And the do something is always external, sense-based, and outward. But the child is doing something, isn't it? Except it's inside, and you are not valuing that. So I've given a series of such examples of the distortions. And so as adults, I said, we are taught to always find solutions outside ourselves. Find happiness outside ourselves, in our circumstances. Find love outside ourselves. Find satisfaction outside ourselves. When in fact all these things are within you. But we've not been taught to turn in. We don't even know what it's like. Example of how a teacher tells the child introspect. What do you really want? What do you feel when you do this? And so on. So one of the persons came back with this interesting feedback. Within a week, she said, I went home. I have two children, both rebellious, one 5 and one 7. They don't listen to us. They're always doing their own, always fighting. And she said, my husband, he never expresses emotions. He's so closed emotionally. And so she started with her children. Every time they did something which she didn't approve of, she would ask them, how do you feel when you do this? And she said within a few days, they picked up on it and they began to talk to themselves. One would tell the other, how do you feel when you do this? And after a while, they began to tell the parents, you know, I'm feeling like this. So the whole inner domain suddenly became vivid. And then one day, one of the children went up to the father and said, I feel that you do not respect me enough. And because of that, I feel hurt and I feel unhappy. And for the first time in their lives, they heard the father express an emotion. And he began to speak of what he feels and began to communicate emotionally. So this woman said as a feedback, just that one incident and that one practice she put in her life has completely changed their whole family dynamic. Very interesting. These are interesting anecdotes which make you think, oh yes, it was worthwhile. Otherwise, sometimes you wonder. Anything someone wants to say? Okay. Sorry? Our intention in being there at the same time in the same space is precisely to invoke a shift in consciousness to impact the governments. To what extent it impacts, one has to see. But since this is something that we know and we can even feel it is true, that there is a much deeper influence that works behind the scenes, which can change people, which can change thoughts, which can even change events. So it's the one thing we can do. Otherwise, the system, the structures of the governments and the United Nations are designed to insulate, to cut off the decision making from reality, and even to reduce the decision making to just symbolic and token terms, and not bind to anything concrete. That's the way the systems are built. At the very least, what we have felt every time in these gatherings is that everybody present, by the very intention that we have, everybody present becomes as if a representative of the group that they're coming from. So certain people from certain countries, some from certain religions or traditions, and because we've assembled with that intention, they become automatically representative of it. And when amongst ourselves something happens, a link forms and a change takes place, which touches the group that they represent. And this is something which one can feel. People go back changed. Similar to the concept of our will. and the representative world that it is. Hmm? Sorry? Yes, yes. It's interesting. Uh-huh. Yes. Yes, this is an unusual change in New Zealand because of the pressure of the indigenous people who consider the rivers to be conscious beings. The legal system has actually adopted this and accepted that idea that the river is a conscious being, and therefore has rights. But since it does not have a capacity to represent itself, the government appoints a representative who will represent the interests of the river in any decision. It's a huge step. Yes. And just that one precedent has led to many others beginning to think in similar ways. Sorry? Oh, I see. I didn't know that, yes. So he says the indigenous people had fought for 140 years to get this idea. But consider where the problem came. The legal system is what came with the colonization, as developed in that period in Europe. And so, because it was a rational-based system, it knocked out anything which that rationality couldn't accept as real. And with it, all the values which were associated with religion were thrown out. So anything which gives consciousness to nature or to forms of nature was associated with the religion which was thrown out by the reason. And so the legal system became this highly reduced, narrowly objectivized life. And that has been imposed everywhere in the world. It's the common framework. The difference is only a few laws here and there. And obviously it's not sustainable. It's one of the reasons why things are being destroyed. I gave this example in the discussion I had. I said, in this system of economics, if you have a piece of land where there are trees, in your balance book, the trees are reflected as a liability because you have to look after them, you have to water them, they could catch disease, they could break down, they could catch fire, etc. They're a liability. That means a negative. If you were to cut the trees, overnight, it would be declared as timber, which is an asset. It's now a positive. It's cash. It's money in your account. So I said, when the economic system considers life as a liability and death as an asset, the logical conclusion is everything will be destroyed. Just a question of time. So these, if you go back to the whole problem, these are a few basic ideas, memes, core ideas which define the whole value system of society and on which everything has been built up. Those need to be corrected. And there are 5 or 6 which I had listed. If you can correct those, all the rest will be recast along in a new form and will not involve this kind of a destruction. So this links in perfectly with what we've been reading in the Synthesis of Yoga, where Sri Aurobindo is describing precisely this. When the mind enters into the movement of the force, identifies with the force, with the movement, the extreme mental state of precipitation into nature is that of the ordinary man who takes his bodily and vital activity and mind movements dependent on them for his whole real existence. This is really what modern life has become. Sri Aurobindo has a very interesting comment he makes. And this we have to appreciate because his view of history is much larger than ours. He says, never in history has there been a civilization which was so exteriorized and so obsessed with its materialism. The extent of the materialism and exteriorization has never been so much in the whole of human history. Now, we've had periods of materialism, and I think every civilization, if they go back long enough, will find cycles of extremes of materialism, spirituality, and all kinds of things in between. But to this extent, where everything else is denied, almost as if you're blinkered, unable to see, refusing to see, and forgetting even the reality of those things, that has never been on this scale across the earth. Now, the only benefit this can have in the long run is to embed us so deeply in the reality of matter that we will never again abandon it as an illusion or as something superficial to be discarded. That's the only positive thing we can say from this exaggeration. But other than that, it has only been harmful. But when humanity returns from there, our link with matter will not be lost. This is the truth of this experience. One of the implications of this exaggerated focus on matter is we are compelled to look for solutions in matter. And the result has been, even in science, to go into matter to a depth which we have not previously done. Going down to molecular structures and rebuilding from there, rearranging atomic structures to create new materials and so on. Where earlier they found this process to be too laborious and too superficial. You could achieve the same thing by an intervention of a different kind, including occult interventions or using formulas of nature which came from an occult insight, which is how many of the medicines from plants were created. You did not need to go down to actually observe molecular structures and their effects. You sensed a particular quality of consciousness, you felt how they could be combined, and you had the result in practice without needing to understand the molecular and atomic devices involved. You wanted to create a great explosion, you did not need to build complex molecular structures. Either with a direct insight, you could build a formula of mixture, or you could invoke an occult power upon a material to create the result. Very simple, very direct. But because we have said only matter is real, we have gone into it to a degree again which has not been done before. But that's not enough. As we come back from this exaggerated focus on matter, recover other and deeper layers of reality, we will be attempting to bridge it now with matter. The result will be that in the immediate human development, we will do things which have not been done before or which could never have been imagined, including, for example, connecting consciously things of the vital, mental, and even spiritual domains down to the most material, physical. One of the results will be, and these are conceived of in our imaginations and in our science fictions, that we would be able to create metal alloys which would grow like living tissue, which could express some kind of emotional response, which could even express some kind of a more obvious life response and even mind response. These are things which are not just in the domain of science fiction. These are also things which have been perceived by people who have glimpsed the future. And so the potential for the future is something quite extraordinary. And however great the past developments may have been in inner and occult masteries of matter, what will follow now has never been equaled. So this is the extreme precipitation into nature, which is part of the ordinary man, and particularly the current phase of humanity, or the just previous phase that we have passed through. The ordinary man who takes his body and the mind movements dependent on them, whole real existence. And the thing which we have rejected in the process, he regards all passivity of the soul as a departure from existence and an approach towards nullity. So the moment you become quiet, the moment you turn inwards, the moment you try to feel in silence or be in silence, it is associated with getting away from life, or you are becoming blank or nothing, a null. The reality though is, when you become very quiet, you are coming in touch with a deeper existence, which has a great power and a greater capacity. And when you act from there, your actions are also that much more powerful and effective. This truth was always known in the earlier religious and spiritual traditions, has been rejected for a while, and is now being gradually rediscovered. In one of the things on the internet, I found Harvard Business School declaring in some study that the skills needed for success in the future in business would be intuition and meditation. And why? It's pretty obvious, because you cannot decide based on logic. Your facts which are given to you are unreliable. The information you have is insufficient. The time frame you have to take a decision is too short. The consequences of an error are too great. You can lose an entire business because of a wrong choice made or a delay made in the choice. Things are moving so fast and the complexity is so great. And the only way forward is to draw upon a deeper faculty where logic and reason fail. And so increasingly there is this resort to intuition. I was interested to hear of many heads of businesses who are following practices of meditation and openly speaking about it. Earlier they were afraid to speak. Not only they speak about it openly, they encourage their team to also practice meditation. And even in large businesses like Google and Apple, they have spaces for people to meditate, concentrate, practice yoga and other kinds of interiorizing movements. The passivity of the soul, its value is beginning to change. But from the extreme, it looks like departure from existence and approach towards nullity. And then Sri Aurobindo says, he lives, that is the ordinary man, he lives on the superficies of the active Brahman. It's not that we are in the active Brahman. It's not even that we are conscious of the active Brahman. The active Brahman itself is so large. When we are so fixated on our body, emotions and surface mind, which is all we need in our normal life, it's not even the whole of the active Brahman, it's the most superficial skin layer. If we were to go within, in what Sri Aurobindo describes as the inner mind, inner vital and inner physical, and all of the subtle worlds and their completenesses, those would be a larger glimpse of the active Brahman. And that glimpse is oceanic. If your physical universe, which you can observe with your telescopes, is infinite, measurably, in the sense that you have 3 dimensions and you can go in 3 distinct different directions into infinity, if you shift a little bit into the subtle physical world, you have not only this physical universal expansion, but you have within it further dimensions which go beyond the 3. So already its infinity is greater. If you further shift into the vital worlds, you experience not only the fullness of this universe, but each fine poise of consciousness has its own experience of the fullness of the universe, different from others. So it's like this fullness of the universe multiplied by millionfold, and each of them forming one fine world of its own. And two of them may not meet at all ever. And that would form just one layer of the vital worlds. So you will find in Savitri, Sri Aurobindo describes these as godheads of the little life, where each of them has his own universe and entirely to himself. They don't even know self-sufficient in their experience of their infinite universe, and you have so many millions and millions of them unendingly. Everything you can conceive, every poise of consciousness, every emotion, every state of being can be experienced as a whole universe and its own world and its own beings and experiences. So you can see, moving away from the gross physical just a little bit, the expanses possible and the infinities in plural possible are infinite. And when you enter the mental world, it becomes even more complex in its experience. And so that would give you some sense of what would be the scope of what we have described here as the active Brahman, the full movement of the energy in the cosmos, that is Brahman. As distinct from the passive Brahman, which is the complete silence, unmoving, unchanging base supporting this larger movement. So he lives in the superficies of the active Brahman, and all the rest is waiting to be discovered and explored. And while to the silent soul exclusively concentrated in the passive self, all activities are mere name and form, to him they are the only reality. And it is the self that is merely a name. So the two things are as if diametrically opposite to each other. It read up to here last time. So you have the active Brahman, you have the passive Brahman. From each extreme, the other looks almost unreal. Except that in the silent Brahman, there is name but no form. You say self, what do you mean? You have no picture. From that side, you look at the world and you say, just names and forms, nothing substantial, nothing existing by itself. Everything simply like waves of energy changing, unstable, unreal almost. In one, the passive Brahman stands aloof from the active and does not share in its consciousness. In the other, the active Brahman stands aloof from the passive and does not share in its consciousness, nor wholly possess its own. So both are looking at each other, but the difference is the passive Brahman knows itself utterly. It is the existence of the self. The active Brahman does not know itself. It is simply struggling movement. And so between the two, although they seem symmetric to each other, one naturally becomes foundation of reality. Each is to the other, in these exclusivenesses, an inertia of status or an inertia of mechanically active non-possession of self, if not altogether an unreality. So seen from one extreme, the silent self is felt as an inertia of status. Well, nothing is moving, nothing is happening, you're just in this silence. Or so it seems from that side. But it's not so. When you're in that silence, it is so deep, so rich, so intense, so complete, that you could remain forever and never get bored. When you actually approach it in the beginning, there's even a kind of, when you first begin to touch it and experience it, there's even a kind of a seductive attraction. It pulls you. Oh, it is so tempting. It is so fulfilling. You want to be in it more and more. You don't want to come back. Why? Because it is so complete. So unlike our concept of it from the other extreme, it's not blank, it's not inertia, it is so full of juice, so to say, rasa, enjoyment. From that extreme, though, looking at this, it is inertia of mechanically active. What? Non-possession of self. You never have yourself. You never know yourself. You're always some world struggling to survive, fading out. Because there's nothing real at the core of the world that could hold you. But it's mechanical inertia of movement in non-possession of self. If not, altogether an unreality. If you take this to the extreme, it will appear almost unreal. But well, you have these two. What do you choose? How do you reconcile? How do you harmonize? Is it possible even to experience both without experiencing one against or the opposite of the other? As we said last time, there must be, logically, some poise of consciousness in which you are both at the same time and complete as a result, because the divine is that. If the divine can be that, because the world exists, we know he is that at the same time. So there must be some poise we should be able to reach. Why is it we have not reached it? Because in the initial focus, in trying to get to the silent Brahman, we took an exclusive focus on the silence. In order to live in life, we took an exclusive focus of precipitation into nature in the movement. Remember the passage it says, the mind is likely to precipitate itself into the consciousness of force instead of possessing it. So we are in the force and therefore whirling in the hurricane. You do not know where you are, what you are. Everything is flying topsy-turvy. Nothing is stable. If you slow down the movement enough, then you have the momentary experience of a stable life. But if you speed it up, look at a big picture across time, it's all quite chaotic. So you have these two extremes because you chose to focus on extremes. Now, is it possible to find a poise where the two become not extremes and yet you're able to live in the full range? And this is what he's taking us to. First, he points out, having experienced that, the silent Brahman, something is realized there which you will never want to lose. And that's your anchor. But the sadhaka who has once seen firmly the essence of things and tasted thoroughly the peace of the silent self is not likely to be content with any state which involves loss of self-knowledge or a sacrifice of the peace of the soul. So two things here which you wouldn't want to let go. And he's using a very important vocabulary. He uses this phrase, tasted. Seen and tasted. Seen firmly the essence of things and tasted thoroughly the peace of the silent self. Why is this vocabulary? I used earlier, almost instinctively, the sense of juice, the sense of fulfillment of that delight, of that state. And it's because, and that's where the word rasa comes, the tasting. One has the sense of being so nourished, so full, and it is not something which is a stagnant, fixed fullness, but a rich, multiple potential. Nothing is moving, nothing is changing, but the potentiality of it is so unendingly rich. And it is as if one is tasting the sap of existence, the sap of delight, the soma in its essence, the delight of the Satchidananda, even in the silence. Light of the silence, unchanging silence, has its delight of itself, and there is the delight of the movement, where the self enjoys its own movement. But it is that aspect of the delight. That's why he uses this phrase, tasted. So, tasted thoroughly the peace of the silent self. And on the other side, he has put also, seen firmly the essence of things. Now, when everything becomes completely still and static and no movement, what is your perception? You're aware. And that awareness is like a sight. You're just aware simply of the silence. And here he uses the phrase, firmly, seen firmly the essence of things. It's as if everything in the universe, if it became quiet, would become this. And so it's the essence of everything, never really cut off. You take any movement, any experience of the universe, and just slow it down. Slow down the activity, slow down the energy, and let everything lapse back into silence. And this is what you come to. If this were not, the movement would not be possible. The movement itself coming to its essence is this. And so it is the sense of being profoundly in the base, essence, backdrop. This is the real. Everything else is movement in front of the real. That's kind of feeling. So he has said, seen firmly the essence of things, tasted thoroughly the peace of the silent self. And once having had this, to precipitate yourself into the movement of the force is to lose yourself. Once again, I am back to my confused, ordinary person, or I don't have the peace anymore. I have only this anxiety. You have that, you will never accept to precipitate entirely, or you will want to go back. So that becomes an anchor automatically. He will not precipitate himself back into the mere individual movement of mind and life and body, with all its ignorance and straining and disturbance. Having been free of it thoroughly, why would you lose that? And yet you would want to engage with life. So you would first get into it as far as you can without losing that, quickly retire to rest in that, and then again re-engage. Try to find some kind of compromise. But if you have to lose something, you would rather lose this than lose that. That's how it will be, initially. Whatever new status he may acquire will only satisfy him if it is founded upon and includes that which he has already found to be indispensable to real self-knowledge, self-delight, and self-possession. So these three phrases represent the three facets of the Satchidananda. Self-knowledge is the Chit, self-delight is the Ananda, and the self-possession is the Sat, the sheer existence. Now, we will come to this later on again, but just briefly to touch upon the correlation. These three things you will find are what our physical, vital, and mental life are trying to replicate. The bodily consciousness tries to give us some sense of self-possession. I am alive because I can feel I am grounded in matter. In my dream state, I am not sure who I am. I am in this floating, unreal sense of I. Many people, when they first begin to meditate, if they go in too much and lose the contact with the physical senses, they say, I felt as if I was in some kind of wandering, dreamlike state. Maybe I fell asleep, but I was conscious that I was wandering. Why? Because you've lost the grip. The thing which for us defines the grip of existing, reality, hard matter, is the body consciousness. Similarly, our vital energies, life force, is what enthuses itself in enjoyment. It is the means by which we enjoy our life. I want, I like, I enjoy. And the whole experiences of the energy is jumping. If you were to somehow suppress your enjoyment, you'll find your energy is dull, depressed. Life is not interesting. You indulge in your excitement and the energy seize you and often take you into extremes which either break down your body or make you do things which your mind would have said, no, that's dangerous. But it You're as if chasing some kind of enjoyment, which satisfies in the moment but never leaves you with lasting satisfaction. So you chase after more and a little more and a little more, each time as if you burn away the satisfaction, needing a greater excitement or novelty to satisfy. So it's a crude imitation of the self-delight, even as the body is a crude imitation of the self-possession, which never really gives you the stability. And the mind is what is a crude imitation and reflection of the self-knowledge. I'm aware that I am. The awareness is reflected here, again crudely, because at the end of the day I can always doubt, is it my imagination? I do not know. So this triple link is very important. In the later discussion, Sri Aurobindo will point out that eventually it is this which is the potential, or pointing to the potential of a divine life on earth. That each of these three principles from the Satchidananda can link to these currently fragmented and insufficient grades of consciousness, infuse their truth into these and awaken in them something more profound and real, and make them instruments to manifest the Satchidananda in the movement, in life. But right now we're only seeing these three, which we don't want to lose. And yet we make an effort to engage with life. What happens then? Still, there is the likelihood of a partial, superficial, and temporary relapse into the old mental movement when he attempts again to ally himself with the activity of the world. Now, somebody has had this deep experience, perhaps even lived in it long enough, and now struggling to re-engage without losing what he had. So the likelihood of three different kinds, he says: partial relapse into the old mental movement, superficial relapse, and temporary relapse. Now there are three facets of this. Any one of these could become large, while the other two are not so large. Let's look at these. First, partial relapse. So it's as if a part of my mind gets back into the old habit. Another part separates itself and either remains immersed or keeps merging back whenever it wants to. But this part, which is partially in the relapse of the old mental movement, what does it do? It does exactly what it was doing before. So you may get a person who may actually experience states of that freedom and peace of the silent Brahman, but on the surface is the same crude, uncultured or badly behaviored, unrefined human, bound to his old habits of ignorance, struggles, and straining and disturbance. Nothing seems to have changed. And you wouldn't know perhaps, unless you could look more deeply. Or he may experience not this partial, but a superficial relapse. So in this very surface part, there is this habit, while the bulk of me is not in this, is living by a different value in a different consciousness. But because of the sense of the gap, the distance between these two extremes, I'm aware of this superficial, but I either find it uninteresting to change it, or I'm incapable of changing it, which also is a real problem. And often the two go hand in hand. You try a little bit, you fail, and then anyway it's not worth it. Why bother? Let it go. And so there have been many yogis with that kind of a realization. And third, temporary relapse. That means for certain states I find myself bound in the old mind, and then I break out again into some deeper. Again I find myself bound, again I break out. Now you will see all of these three are normal to all of us, not in relation to the silent Brahman, but to any deeper spiritual poise that we may have attained during some deep concentration, meditation, or when we have received some special descent of a higher consciousness. We try to hold on to that, and at some point we have to re-engage with life, if nothing else, to eat food or interact with people or just basic survival biology needs. And at that point, as we are doing the activity, this can happen. A partial relapse, something in us gets mixed up, or a superficial relapse. Internally, your whole concentration is within, you're in that state, your body and your mind does things mechanically. Even you can get a phone call, you may reply to the phone, somebody says, oh, how are you? If it's your birthday, you say, happy birthday, you say, thank you, thank you. You put it back and momentarily you say, oh, who was that? You see, superficially you did a response, but your attention was elsewhere. Or temporary. You find yourself lost, oh my God, I don't want to lose that. You snap back, recover. And something happens, you're required to do some very complex things involving your mind. While you're doing it, you forget yourself and you snap back. These are the three types of partial relapse into old mental movement. Now you will notice Sri Aurobindo is not speaking of a change in the vital consciousness or the physical consciousness here. It's just the mental awareness and all the rest that follows. Because that's all you really have. It is through the mind that you know your emotions and your body senses. So it is in the mind first that the shift will take place. And from there, as it is sustained, it will reform the other layers. And he uses another interesting phrase, suggestive. When he attempts again to ally himself to the activity of the world. What's align? Alliance, friendship. Coming into the same line, living by the same values. Now, having been into some deeper state, all this looks not only superficial, not only unreal, but false. The values of your life are so false. And you come back and you have to re-engage with those values, and something seems out of place. You may even refuse, saying this is all falsehood. But if you come by new values which are so different, you cannot fit in with this world anymore. And so there is an attempt to ally. Attempts. You can never do it completely because you're so fundamentally changed. And this is the problem we face often when we, even as a community, develop certain core values which are so different. And people coming from a different world meet, and there's a complete miscommunication without even realizing it. I was this morning just discussing with somebody that people in our communities are often so innocent. I may even use, but innocent is the right word. They do not realize that often people they may meet from entirely different spaces live by very different values. They take things for face value, believe what someone says for face value, do not realize that they are being played, and the other person is conscious that they are playing because they have been living their whole life playing in their relationships. So we don't realize and we feel overwhelmed. Oh, this person actually did this for me or said this to me and I feel so grateful. Whereas for the other person, it's what they do with everybody they meet in their business life or in their social life, and it meant nothing. And there's a complete disconnect in the values. And Sri Aurobindo refers to this in the Life Divine. Initially, in anywhere that the Gnostic community begins to form, and we are not yet a Gnostic community, but moving in that direction, the interface between the old world and the new world is where the clash takes place. The values are so reversed, so opposite to each other. And so there's a struggle to align yourself with this. So there's this phrase Sri Aurobindo uses, attempts again to ally himself to the activity of the world, is suggestive of this. Something is a fundamentally changed, and yet you have to find some way to connect. To perhaps, or to cure it when it arrives, because it will arrive. These things will happen. You will have these mixes. Or to cure it when it arrives. He gives you the solution. And Sri Aurobindo says, he has to hold fast to the truth of Satchidananda and extend his realization of the Infinite One into the movement of the infinite multiplicity. He has to concentrate on and realize the one Brahman in all things as conscious force of being, as well as pure awareness of conscious being. The self as the all, not only in the unique essence of things, but in the manifold form of things. So this is the cure that Sri Aurobindo is proposing for this bridging, which will lead you into a consciousness in which you are able not only to live in the perfect silence, but as well act in the full play of the cosmos without experiencing this opposition or division between these two extremes. And so the method is first to get to that silence, from there re-engage with the world partially, superficially, temporarily, whatever form it takes. And every time that you find a mix, to correct it by this process. Hold fast to the truth of Satchidananda. Now we will apply this not only in understanding this deeper experience, but we will apply it to any experience we have. Any poise of a deeper consciousness that we are able to enter in, live in, or experience even momentarily. So you have had a special birthday, a special concentration, a deep meditation, a poise of a relation with the divine presence within, an afflatus, a descent of the spiritual force or consciousness or joy or light or peace, whatever form it has taken, and you feel that in you. From here now you re-engage with your forms of life. Hold fast to the truth of what is within you, of Satchidananda in this case, and extend his realization of the Infinite One into the movement of the infinite multiplicity. So it's as if from here you bring this awareness and beginning to perceive it in movement. So the first is the oneness into the movement of the infinite multiplicity. You begin to see it everywhere around you, outside you, in things, in the movement. And then, so this is the first thing only. After that, he has to concentrate on and realize the one Brahman in all things as, and he gives this double description. So it's not enough to look into this and say, yes, this is the force of the Brahman playing. He says, you have to realize the one Brahman in all things as conscious force of being as well as pure awareness of conscious being. Both you have to begin to see in each. So force of being, there is the Brahman which you are perceiving now everywhere. In its oneness, in its silence, it is there equally in this force of being, which is conscious, expressing itself, flowing, pouring to become this, as well as the pure awareness of conscious being. The being is conscious and it is aware of itself. So that's the static side. The force of being, which is conscious, is the dynamic side. And both of these you have to begin to see. Now as an exercise, it is something we can do even as we are. With the mind's awareness, dwell upon the idea of the oneness. The idea of one silent presence of the self in all things, filling everything like an ether. Remember, it's an exercise Sri Aurobindo has recommended earlier. Except you must go beyond the concept of an ether. That this presence not only is in space and time, but also is outside space and time. The same one. And it is the one outside space and time which is its deepest. So you get to that, and that fills here, all this. And then from here you're aware that this is presence which is conscious. and delighting in its consciousness, in its existence. And that then you begin to imprint and feel and see in all things. So as an exercise, it is doable and prepares our mind and our deeper parts to open to and experience the deeper layers of it. And then he now elaborates what this means, what this leads to as you continue. The self as the all, not only in the unique essence of things, but in the manifold form of things. So earlier you saw it as the essence, that ether-like essence which is in all things, forming all things, as if all this matter is foam and the underlying ether. But now you also see it as the form of things. It is that which becomes foam. It is that which pushes out the force which foams out to become this matter equally. And not only this, everything. All this essence is also foaming out in force to become movement, which is at the same time the silence. So not only in the unique essence of things, but in the manifold form of things. Not only as containing all in a transcendent consciousness, but as becoming all by constituting consciousness. So recall the earlier description of an ether and a transcendence beyond time and space, which is like a container holding the whole universe, filling it. But also, it is not just that, it is becoming all, because it pours into all this, into the container, and becomes the substance and the flow and the force and the forms of the container, both equally. This is the next step towards his true possession of existence. So very clear steps are given. The practicality of the text is also to be recognized even in our current level of awareness. In proportion as this realization is accomplished, the status of consciousness as well as the mental view proper to it will change. Now here's the most important thing. Remember, so far, when you enter the mind and its old habits, it was the old ways. But as you begin to do this, something changes in the perspective and the status of the mind and the way it sees things. And that's when you're beginning what we may describe as a transformation of the mind. It begins to be infused with that influence and its values, and it begins to be recast. You begin to perceive things differently. What happens? How does it see? Instead of an immutable self containing name and form, containing without sharing in them the mutations of nature, there will be the consciousness of the self, immutable in essence, unalterable in its fundamental poise, but constituting and becoming in its experience all these existences which the mind distinguishes as name and form. So earlier, when the mind was concentrating on that with an exclusive focus, it knew the self. It knew it contained all these forms, but it was not sharing the forms. There was a gap. There was that schism we spoke of earlier. And the two cannot be joined because this is silent, that is moving. And yet this is the container for all that. But now you experience the consciousness of the self. In essence, it is unchanging, but it flows, it pours out, it becomes the substance of all this, and it flows to become all these in experience. And everything which we distinguish as name and form, this object, that thing, these things, are all formed of that flowing play. And then, all formations of mind and body will be not merely figures reflected in the Purusha, but the real forms, of which Brahman, self, conscious being, is the substance, and as it were, the material of their formation. Now, this description is so important because it straightaway negates the illusoriness. While earlier, when you were in some immersed silence, all this became kind of distant and unreal, superficial. Now, what you're beginning to see is even the mind, even the body, everything. It's not just things happening which reflect in your silent consciousness, but they are actually substance, the this consciousness as it pours and forms them. So what you're experiencing now from this pours out this energy, becomes the form of the world and the movement of the world. Separate poises one single whole reality. The gap is healed. The name attaching to the form will be not a mere conception of the mind, answering to no real existence bearing the name, but there will be behind it a true power of conscious being, a self-experience of the Brahman answering to something that it contained potential but unmanifest in its silence. Now the sentence sounds complicated, but what he's saying is actually very simple and quite obvious. He says, earlier, when you saw an object, let's say you take this flower. What is this? Say flower. Surface mind, oh yeah, flower. I have so many associations with what this flower was and my experiences with it. But when you go into the silence, what is this? Almost unreal figment. All things, equally, everything. Now it is this exactly which your artificial intelligence is also seeing through the camera, a series of dots. The dots of light coming from this flower are equivalent to the dots of light coming from the leaves. No difference. Coming from the empty space, no difference. It's all one flat screen on which you have a pattern of colors, lights. And the artificial intelligence has to learn to somehow identify and separate this and give it the name flower and form separate object, flower. You see, the struggle that artificial intelligence has is the same struggle that your self consciousness of silence will have looking at the world. One flat screen of this play of lights. What is the reality of this versus that? Nothing in itself. It comes, it goes, it's just a moving light image. Like a projector on the screen playing lights, or a TV screen with flickering images. Nothing permanent in itself. This was the earlier experience. Now what happens? The name is not just a mere conception of mind, answering to nothing in particular. That is how it was earlier. There's nothing special about it. Now you look at it and you say, the name is something special. Behind it, there is a true power of conscious being. And what is that power which makes flower flower? It is Brahman in his silence, knowing himself, without changing himself, knowing himself capable of being flower. Brahman in his silence experiences himself, flower, leaf, tree, mountain, ocean, planet, galaxy, universe. All of these are perceptions he has of himself. And when he perceives himself flower and experiences flower, that is the power behind this which forms this. And you see and feel that. So that's what he's saying. There will be behind it a true power of conscious being. A true self-experience of the Brahman. Brahman experiences himself as this. Answering to something that it contained potential but unmanifest in its silence. So the flower exists in the silence itself. In the silence, Brahman knew, flower, but unmanifest. Now in the active Brahman, that which was potential in the passive has come forward and become the flower. And behind it is the full power of the Brahman's silence. choosing to experience this form. And name has a power. Form has a reality of experience. And everything in the universe is made like this. Potentialities in the silent Brahman pouring out to become forms with names. Everything pre-exists. Everything is real. No gap, no division, one whole reality. And yet, in all its mutations, it will be realized as one, free, and above them. So even as the flower is nothing but the potential of Brahman expressing as form and name, where is the Brahman? Always one. Never lost. Even when it puts out leaves, they are not two things. It is one Brahman who is entirely flower, who is entire leaves, and who is entirely container of both, expanding himself to lay out the screen for the play. And equally in both, in each. So, and yet in all its mutations, it will be realized as one, free. It's never bound. It can put all these out, it's still free of them. Its silence is unchanged. And above them. Even if all this movement was extinguished, it would remain. It can pour itself out unendingly in all the movements, infinitely and eternally across space and time, and it is still above them, unbound, free, and in silence and one. So you have the continuum, but the continuum does not bind you. It does not mean that this, because it's an expression from the silence, there's an attachment. The silence always remains. No contradiction. The realization of soul reality, suffering the imposition of names and forms, will give place to that of eternal being throwing itself out into infinite becoming. Remember earlier what was the experience? You had one reality in the silence. Against it was names and forms like an image imposed. Suffering them even, because they are unreal. Now instead it gives place to one eternal being throwing itself out into infinite becoming. So it is the Lord pouring himself out that becomes the universe. All existences will be to the consciousness of the yogin soul forms and not merely idea forms of the self. Now this is the experience when this is complete. Right now, what is flower? A rose is a rose is a rose. You remember the famous statement, a rose by any other name smells sweet. They're all poets telling you these statements. Why? Because they're seeing something behind the name, behind the form, the sweetness that the soul that expresses itself in the rose. And so it's as if you're seeing things not just because, this is idea of rose, idea of tree, but you feel thing behind which is the soul of it. Forms of soul, forms of soul, forms of soul, revealing. And it means because you are living in that grade of consciousness, you begin to perceive that in everything. It's as if, people who are always lying, they think everybody else is lying. Why? Because that's the consciousness they live in, they reflect what is happening. That's all they can see. People who live in deep thought, if you say something silly to them, they'll start thinking, what am I missing? There must be some deep thought behind it. You see, because that's the value, but that's the perception. They're trying to see what is behind your words. And if you begin to feel the divine presence within you, automatically you begin to perceive it in everything and in everyone. Because you live by that value. And so when you begin to live in the consciousness of the silent Brahman, and from there you begin to experience the flow of that flowing to become everything, well, it is that which forms everything, and that is the soul, that is the essence of everything. And the whole universe is seen as soul manifesting. And therefore everything in it is that. And at this point it is effortless. It is not something one has to make an effort for. In our current consciousness, you can still have glimpses of this with an effort. You can sit and concentrate on the flower and try to feel the one that is this living being. And after a while you begin to feel it. You can feel the tree as a living being, even the mountain and the earth you can relate to. But at that point you're just beginning to perceive one layer behind the appearance of the, often it is the life energy. And if you're able to feel your deeper layers approaching your soul or psychic vibration, then to that extent you will begin to be able to perceive that also in the tree, in the flower, in the mountain. Something of its psychic presence, of its essential soul and personality. But here at this point you're going down to the deepest soul, the self in everything, and all is soul form, not merely idea form of the self. All of our current life is idea forms. You'll see how easily people are able to say, this is a horse, that is cow. But if you actually met the person that came to you in the form of the horse, you look at it, I've never met you. Who are you? Such a wonderful being. And only if you live in that consciousness will you have that experience. So when often you have these stories in the mythologies, they're not only real but also symbolic at the same time. A god will come disguised as something. Shiva comes as a beggar. And you look and you do not see because you were not living in that consciousness. But when you're living in the consciousness, you see right through them. There's this beautiful story of three gods who are coming to test the wife of a rishi. And so they come to her and I think it is Brahma, Vishnu. Huh? Mahesh also? Okay, so all three of them come. They're going to test her. And they say that we are your guests, so please feed us. And she says, surely. She recognizes who they are. And so they say, all right, but we ask that you feed us breast milk. Now that is a problem for her, obviously. The whole challenge is this. So she says, all right, because she knows who they are. She says, all right, now you are my children. And immediately they become babies. And she suckles them and feeds them. And after that, the whole universe is in a mess because the presiding deities have become little babies. So there's a whole story around how it has to be set right. But the idea is this. She saw immediately who they were. The similar test which is made in the life of Nala and Damayanti. So she is tested for whether she is able to recognize her husband. And so the two of the gods come, they stand next to her husband. And he is exactly like the husband. And she is asked to now recognize who is the true husband. And she is able to recognize. And the story, it is a very deep truth which is taught. As children, you catch what it is. So when she recognizes the true one, she puts a garland around him. And they ask, well, how did you recognize? And she says, the gods don't blink and they don't cast a shadow. A very deep truth. You can, of course, see it literally, which also has its validity. A being that materializes from the subtle world has a difference in behavior. And one of the signs is they don't blink as easily, or a shadow also may not be there, depending on the degree of materialization. But something else more deeply. You see, they are in their consciousness, there's no shadow. They're transparent. And one can sense that if you have that sensitivity within yourself, if you are transparent enough, you can recognize somebody who's transparent. So the test was not so much can you recognize the form. It was of her consciousness. She's able to perceive that because she is herself pure in her consciousness. There are interesting stories like that. But they all indicate where you are living at. And based on where you are living is how you see. So here, all existence will be to the consciousness of the yogin soul forms. The divinity itself as soul taking on form. Not merely idea forms of the self. So each experience you have will not be like your mind says, tree, elephant, stone, bird. each you will see as forms of the divine. Naturally, you will relate to each one in that spirit. So the whole experience of the world is so different. Not ideas and pictures of our mind as we breeze through life without really relating to anything deeply. So they are soul forms of the self. And remember, you are living in a consciousness in oneness with the self. So if everything is soul form of the self, then they are soul forms of himself. One with him, contained in his universal existence. So as you look at the things, you feel, these are in me. They are soul forms of myself. One with me, in me. And so what's the relationship like with everything when you meet it like this? And Sri Aurobindo is describing the experience, and as you read it, you can find something in you leaning towards that. So all existences will be to the consciousness of the yogin, soul forms, and not merely idea forms of the self. You'll still have idea forms. You can operate with the mind, but not just that. Of himself, one with him, contained in his universal existence. All the soul life, mental, vital, bodily existences of all that exists will be to him one indivisible movement and activity of the being, capital B, who is the same forever. Now you see this simultaneously, there is the unchanging divine being moving in all this movement, activity, soul, mental, vital, physical. So you see the sequence, because now perception first is of the soul form, from there the mental form, vital form, and then the bodily form. One indivisible being, who is the same forever, even while the movement changes. He is the same. The sense of this you can get when you look at a whirlpool. It's spinning, and yet it's the same forever, the same spinning, and yet it's moving. Everything is like that. He is always the same as he moves unendingly. The self will be realized as the all in its double aspect of immutable status and mutable activity. And it is this that will be seen as the comprehensive truths of our existence. It comprehends, it includes everything, and this is the reality, the existence. And this perception was the basis of the whole Vedic experience and is at the background of all the descriptions of the Vedic texts. And that's why unless one begins with this, you do not understand what it is and why is it that they say things the way they say. But this is also our deepest truth, our deepest reality. And in any tradition, if you go deep enough, somewhere you will find ideas aligning with this vision. Not always explicitly stated, not always completely stated, but glimpses, perceptions, alignments. It is this which was at the backdrop of all of our original traditions everywhere on earth. We have gone out of sync with this in a severely exaggerated way in these last few hundred years. For whatever purpose it has served in our evolution, that correction has to happen. In humanity, the correction will be slow, gradual, beginning from the surface in, first recognizing the vitality which is one, then the deeper consciousness which is one, then eventually the deeper soul which is one, and so on. Slow, take 1,000,000 years, does not matter. But for those of us who choose to take the more rapid path, instead of going through the slow, gradual way, you will recall Sri Aurobindo says at the beginning of the chapter, aim straight at the realization of pure self-existence on the highest plane. And from that secure basis, realize spiritually how the self becomes all existence without the descent into the divided egoistic consciousness. And so this is what the chapter has described to us. Go straight to the oneness, the silent Brahman, and from there re-embrace the multiplicity and the active Brahman, and heal the divide, recover the completeness of reality, one being. And that's what he brings us to at the end of this chapter. Those of us who choose this can attain to this within our lifetime as we are, or to whatever degree that we are able to with the effort that we, or the readiness that we have. Whatever little we have is worthwhile and becomes for the evolution of humanity the frontal edge of evolution. Those of us even who make the effort, whatever the degree of success, already have the opportunity to be at the cutting edge. And it is here that the full focus of the pressure of evolution is, not only from below as nature is aspiring for this healing, but also from above as the divine consciousness is descending to assist in this leap and fulfillment of our evolution. So this is the foundation spiritually for that. You heal the gap of this passive and active Brahman. You heal at the same time the divine in its origin and the divine in its manifestation in human form. And then the rest of the process of integration and transformation can proceed. But this poise is like a first step or a second step. The first being the realization of the self in silence. This becomes like the second step. And this poise, Sri Aurobindo describes in the next chapter, elaborates upon it and all the complexities of the experience, and in what way it relates to life. And he describes the chapter as the cosmic consciousness. Basically, when we give up our narrow frontal little ego self for this larger complete experience of self and unite with it, then we have given up the individual consciousness for the cosmic consciousness, very simply. But within the experience of the cosmic consciousness, there are gradations, degrees, finer and more complete dimensions, which he maps out now, which we will take up from next Friday. So we have crossed our time, but it was worth it to complete the chapter. Any comments or questions? We can end with the Om together.